What if the version of Christianity taught for nearly 2,000 years is only the edited edition, shaped by politics, power, and the needs of an empire, and somewhere far from Rome, hidden behind mountains and monasteries? Another version quietly survived? Today's video asks one question that can shake the foundation of everything we think we know about Jesus. What if Ethiopia preserved the oldest, least altered memory of his teachings the Western world was never meant to hear? This isn't fiction. This isn't conspiracy. This comes from real manuscripts, real archaeology, and a tradition that claims to have guarded the faith before the Roman Empire ever held a council or built a cathedral. In the West, our Bibles have 66 books, Protestant, or 73, Catholic. But Ethiopia's ancient canon, it has 81, including texts banned, forgotten, or declared too dangerous for the institutional church. Manuscripts like the Garima Gospels were carbon dated to around 330 AD, meaning they were written before the Council of Nicaea even decided which stories about Jesus were acceptable. Think about that. Rome defined Christianity. Ethiopia preserved Christianity, and the two versions do not tell the same story. While Western Gospels describe a resurrected Jesus appearing briefly to his disciples before ascending, Ethiopia holds something different, a text known as the Book of the Covenant, Mashafa Kidan, a 40-day record of teachings attributed to Jesus after rising from the dead. Not symbolic teachings, not fragments, 40 full days of guidance, warnings, cosmology, and spiritual truths that do not appear in any Western Bible. Some of these teachings sound shockingly prophetic. A warning that his message would be twisted to build kingdoms of men. A prediction that temples of stone would overshadow the temple of the soul. A description of a humanity walking alive but spiritually dead, trapped in a world built by a shadow creator. A challenge that salvation is not a ritual, but a personal awakening, even if you don't believe they are authentic. You cannot deny one thing. These writings reveal a picture of early Christianity far more mysterious, mystical, and introspective than anything Rome allowed into its canon. But this is not just about manuscripts. It is also about a country whose spiritual history is unlike any other on earth. Ethiopia is the only African nation never colonized, a kingdom whose rulers claim descent from King Solomon, and the only nation that insists it still guards the Ark of the Covenant in the city of Axum. Its monks spent centuries copying and preserving texts that the Western world considered heretical. Not because they rebelled, but because they believed these writings were part of a sacred inheritance dating back to Jerusalem itself. And here's where it becomes truly fascinating. For 2,000 years, the West believed it had the complete story. But today, thanks to archaeology, carbon dating, and new translations, these Ethiopian texts are emerging from the shadows, and they challenge almost everything we thought we understood about Jesus, the early church, and the origins of Christianity. Why were these texts hidden? Why were they excluded? And what do they actually say about humanity, the soul, the universe, and our place in it? More importantly, why do so many of these ancient teachings feel strangely relevant to the spiritual crisis our world is facing today? In the next section, we will step inside the Ethiopian canon, explore the 40 days of secret teachings, and examine how these writings completely overturned the familiar narrative shaped by Rome. This is the story you were never told, and once you hear it, you will never see the Bible or history the same way again. When scholars first encountered Ethiopia's 81-book canon, they expected it to be a regional variation. Interesting, maybe unusual, but ultimately familiar. What they found instead was something closer to a parallel universe, because inside these ancient manuscripts is a picture of early Christianity that feels raw, untamed, and startlingly different from the Rome-approved version we inherited. Let's start with the text that has shocked historians the most. The Book of the Covenant, a detailed record of 40 days after the resurrection. In the Western Bible, the resurrected Jesus appears briefly, Emmaus, the upper room, the shore of Galilee, and then he ascends. The story is tidy, controlled, wrapped up before anything too dangerous can be said. But the Ethiopian record describes something else. A Jesus who doesn't slip away into heaven. A Jesus who stays. A Jesus who teaches for 40 entire days, long enough to establish a worldview, long enough to warn his followers about the future, long enough to reshape the faith before it even began. And his first message, according to these texts, wasn't comfort, it was a warning. He told his disciples that over time, his words would be twisted, not by outsiders, but by men claiming to follow him. People would use his name to build empires, temples of stone, and systems of power while neglecting the inner life of the soul. Look around the world today. Does it really sound impossible? What if the corruption Jesus warned about isn't something coming at the end of days, but something that already happened in the first few centuries? Because that's exactly what the Ethiopian tradition suggests. When Rome embraced Christianity, faith and empire fused into one machine. The story had to be simple. The doctrines had to be uniform. The power structure had to be absolute. Anything that empowered individuals over institutions was cut away. And Ethiopia, far beyond Rome's reach, ended up preserving everything that didn't fit the empire's narrative. For example, the Western Gospels show Jesus proving his physical resurrection by letting Thomas touch his wounds. A powerful moment. But in the Ethiopian text, he says something radically different. The body is a garment. It tears. The spirit does not. That single line overturns centuries of doctrine. Instead of emphasizing physical resurrection, it points to inner awakening, something that doesn't require priests, rituals, or political endorsement. And then comes the most unsettling part. The Ethiopian writings describe two forces shaping human life: the fire that rises toward light and the fire that descends toward emptiness. Every thought, every intention feeds one or the other. Salvation, therefore, is not a transaction but a transformation. This sounds less like institutional religion and more like a spiritual revolution. And it goes deeper. The texts speak of a shadow builder, a lesser creator responsible for the material world, echoing ideas found in early Jewish mysticism and later declared heresy by Rome. If true, it means Jesus wasn't simply a moral teacher. He was describing the architecture of reality itself. But here's where things become truly controversy. Some Ethiopian traditions, along with other banned ancient writings, claim Jesus may not have died on the cross at all. They suggest he escaped, just as prophets before him fled into the wilderness. Some say he traveled east toward India and Tibet. Others say he returned to Ethiopia, a land already connected to Jerusalem through the Queen of Sheba and the legendary journey of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, whether you believe these accounts or not, the historical pattern is undeniable. Every document that encouraged free thought, inner awakening, or spiritual independence was removed from the Western canon. Every document that encouraged obedience to institutions survived. So ask yourself, were these texts removed because they were false or because they were uncontrollable? Because Ethiopia's version of Christianity is centered not on fear or punishment, but on awakening, the kind of awakening that no empire can regulate, in a world hungry for spiritual depth and tired of religious politics. These ancient writings suddenly feel less like relics and more like a roadmap we were never allowed to see. So what do we do with all of this? What do we do when a forgotten stream of Christianity, older, untouched, and blisteringly honest, returns to the surface after nearly 2,000 years? Do we ignore it? Do we fear it? Or do we finally let ourselves ask the questions that earlier generations were too afraid to ask? Because whether these Ethiopian texts are literal history, symbolic wisdom, or a mixture of both, one truth is impossible to deny. They force us to confront the parts of Christianity that were shaped more by emperors than by apostles. And maybe that discomfort is the point. For centuries, people have sensed that something was missing. Why does the Jesus of the Western tradition feel so restrained, so carefully packaged, when his words were powerful enough to terrify Rome? Why do his teachings, in the familiar canon, feel incomplete, like chapters were torn out of a book we never got to finish? Ethiopia's ancient tradition doesn't fix these questions, but it does widen this frame. It reveals a Jesus who speaks not only about heaven and hell, but about consciousness, inner fire, the architecture of the soul, and the dangers of spiritual corruption. A Jesus who challenges institutions, not supports them. A Jesus who tells his followers to look inward, not upward. A Jesus whose message doesn't belong to governments, councils, or empires, but to every human heart. And maybe that is why this version disappeared for so long. If the earliest followers of Jesus heard this message, one centered on awakening, not obedience, how would the history of the world look different today? Would there have been crusades, colonization, religious wars, fear-driven doctrines? Or would faith have grown into something more contemplative, more compassionate, more human? That is the uncomfortable question Ethiopia forces us to ask. While empires rose and fell, while wars reshaped continents, while entire libraries of sacred texts were burned or banned, Ethiopia kept copying, kept memorizing, kept protecting. Not because they wanted to overthrow Rome, but because they believed they were safeguarding a truth the world wasn't ready for. Maybe the world is ready now, today. More people than ever are searching for meaning outside institutions. They're questioning inherited beliefs. They're sensing that spirituality is bigger than ritual, bigger than doctrine, bigger than what they were told as children. And when these Ethiopian texts finally surface, texts that speak directly to the inner world, to personal responsibility, to the battle inside every human soul, they suddenly feel less like ancient relics and more like the missing chapters we've been waiting for. After 2,000 years of silence, the forgotten voices from the mountains of Ethiopia are speaking again. Their message isn't violent. It isn't political. It isn't demanding allegiance. It's inviting awakening. It's inviting you to discover your own connection to the divine, not the one shaped by councils, but the one shaped by the inner fire Jesus spoke about in these ancient writings. What will you do with this knowledge? Awakening is personal. Truth is alive. And the journey has always been yours. If this story sparks something in you, a question, a curiosity, a sense that there is more waiting to be uncovered, then tell me in the comments, what part of this forgotten history surprised you the most? And do you think the world is finally ready to hear the version of Christianity that survived outside Rome? Your insights might be the spark that someone else needs.